Every morning at 6:45, in a mansion overlooking the occupied streets of Warsaw, a cup of coffee was prepared with meticulous care. The porcelain was French. The silver spoon bore the monogram of a family that no longer existed. The brew was strong, bitter, and served at exactly 175 degrees Fahrenheit. But there was something the general didn't know about his morning ritual, something that would have made even the most hardened SS officer recoil in disgust. The water used to make his coffee, the very liquid that touched his lips every single day, came from the toilet bowl in the servants' quarters. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't negligence. This was war, fought one cup at a time, by a woman whose name history almost forgot. Her name was Aniela Nowak, and before the war she had been nobody special. Just another Polish woman in her mid-30s, working as a chambermaid in one of Warsaw's grand hotels. She had soft hands back then, a quick smile, and dreams of saving enough money to open a small bakery near the old town square. She would wake before dawn to polish silverware, arrange fresh flowers in the lobbies, and turn down beds for guests who never learned her name. Life was simple, predictable, and hers. Then came September of 1939, and everything she knew turned to ash. The German tanks rolled through the streets like a black tide, and within weeks Warsaw became a city of ghosts. The hotel where she worked was seized by the Wehrmacht and converted into officers' quarters. Aniela, along with dozens of other Polish staff, was given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all: work for the occupiers or starve. The mansion where she ended up was different from the hotel. It wasn't just occupied, it was possessed. Obersturmbannführer Heinrich Vogel had claimed it as his personal residence, and he ran it like a miniature concentration camp. Vogel was a man who believed in order, in hierarchy, in the absolute dominance of the master race. He would inspect the dust on windowsills with a white glove, measure the distance between silverware with a ruler, and dismiss servants for the slightest imperfection. His reputation preceded him. He had overseen operations in the Warsaw ghetto, signed deportation orders with the casual indifference of a man approving lunch menus, and now he lived in luxury while the city starved around him. Every morning he demanded his coffee. Every morning Aniela made it. The other servants whispered about small acts of resistance: a cook who would spit in the soup when nobody was looking, a gardener who deliberately planted flowers in the wrong colors, breaking the perfect symmetry Vogel demanded. But these were desperate, almost meaningless gestures in the face of such overwhelming evil. Aniela understood something the others didn't. She understood that resistance didn't have to be loud to be real. It didn't have to be dramatic to matter. Sometimes the most profound acts of defiance were the ones the enemy never even noticed. Sometimes reclaiming your dignity meant making a monster drink from the same filth he forced you to live in. The servants' bathroom was on the ground floor, tucked away in a corner of the mansion that Vogel never visited. The toilet had a crack in the bowl. The water that pooled there was technically clean, filtered through the same municipal system that supplied the rest of the house, but it was still toilet water. It still carried the psychological weight of degradation, of being treated as less than human. And every morning, while the other servants prepared breakfast in the kitchen, Aniela would slip into that bathroom with a small pitcher. She would fill it carefully, making sure not to splash, not to leave evidence. Then she would return to the kitchen, boil that water, add the grounds and serve it to the general with a steady hand and a blank expression. This went on for 8 months. 243 cups of coffee, 243 mornings where a Polish chambermaid looked a Nazi general in the eye and smiled, while he drank her quiet, invisible revenge. He never knew. He never suspected. And that was exactly the point. Because in a world where everything had been taken from her, where her country was occupied, her people murdered, and her future erased, Aniela Nowak had discovered the one thing the SS couldn't control: the absolute, unshakable power of her own contempt. Warsaw in 1940 was a city learning how to disappear. The streets that once buzzed with cafes and bookshops now echoed with the sound of German boots and barked commands. Curfews turned night into a prison. Ration cards turned food into currency, and everywhere, plastered on every wall and lamppost, were the new rules: Jews forbidden here, Poles forbidden there, German only, Polish forbidden, obey or die. The occupation wasn't just military, it was surgical. It was designed to cut away everything that made Warsaw Polish, everything that made its people human, until all that remained was a workforce too terrified to resist. For people like Aniela, survival meant learning to become invisible, to move through the day without being seen, without being remembered, without giving the occupiers any reason to notice you existed. The mansion on Aleje Ujazdowski had once belonged to the Kowalski family, wealthy textile merchants who fled to London when the invasion began. Now it served as the personal residence of Obersturmbannführer Heinrich Vogel, and everything about it had been transformed to reflect Nazi aesthetics. The Polish paintings were taken down and replaced with portraits of Hitler. The library, once filled with Polish literature and poetry, was purged and restocked with German military texts and copies of Mein Kampf. Even the garden was redesigned, the wild, romantic Polish flower beds ripped out and replaced with rigid geometric patterns that Vogel inspected every Sunday morning. The message was clear: Poland was being erased, one mansion, one street, one life at a time. And the people who worked there, the Polish servants who cooked and cleaned and served, were expected to participate in their own erasure without complaint. Aniela had been assigned to the mansion in February of 1940, 3 months after a German officer came to her apartment and informed her that her hotel job no longer existed. She was given an address, a time to report, and a warning that failure to comply would result in deportation to a labor camp. When she arrived at the mansion, she found 11 other Polish servants already there: 2 cooks, 3 housemaids, 4 gardeners, a driver and a butler who had worked for the Kowalski family for 30 years and now served the men who destroyed everything he loved. They were all terrified. They all knew what happened to Poles who displeased their German masters. Rumors circulated constantly: a maid beaten unconscious for breaking a plate, a cook sent to Auschwitz for serving lukewarm soup, a driver shot in the street for arriving 5 minutes late. Fear was the currency of occupied Warsaw, and everyone paid. Vogel himself was exactly what you would expect from a man who rose through the SS ranks by being more ruthless than his peers. He was 42 years old, tall, thin, with sharp features and eyes that never blinked. He spoke Polish fluently, which somehow made him more terrifying, because it meant he understood every whispered conversation, every muttered complaint. He had fought in the First World War, earned an Iron Cross and joined the Nazi Party in 1923, back when it was still a fringe movement of angry veterans and failed intellectuals. Now he was a senior officer in the occupation government, responsible for coordinating the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto and the deportation of tens of thousands of Jews to Treblinka. His mornings began with coffee, breakfast and paperwork that decided who lived and who died. His evenings ended with cognac, classical music, and the satisfied sleep of a man who believed he was building a better world. Aniela's duties were simple: wake at 5 in the morning, prepare the general's breakfast, clean his bedroom and private study, lay out his uniforms, and disappear before he noticed her. She was not allowed to speak unless spoken to. She was not allowed to make eye contact. She was not allowed to exist as anything more than a function, a piece of human furniture that performed tasks and then vanished. And for the first 3 weeks, she did exactly that. She kept her head down, followed orders, and tried not to think about what her labor was supporting, what evil she was helping to function smoothly. But then came the morning when she saw the lists on his desk, the columns of names marked for deportation, and she recognized one of them: her neighbor's daughter, a girl of 16 who played violin and dreamed of studying in Paris. That was the morning everything changed. That was the morning Aniela Nowak stopped being invisible and became dangerous. The idea didn't come to her all at once. It wasn't a moment of dramatic inspiration or righteous fury. It was something quieter, something that grew in the space between obedience and hatred. Aniela had spent 3 weeks watching Vogel live in luxury while Warsaw starved, watching him sip French wine while Polish children begged in the streets, watching him sign documents that sent families to their deaths and then complain that his breakfast eggs were too runny. And somewhere in that toxic mixture of powerlessness and rage, a thought took root. If she couldn't stop him, if she couldn't save the people on his lists, if she couldn't fight back in any way that mattered, then at least she could make sure he never enjoyed another clean moment in his stolen house. At least she could poison his comfort with her contempt. At least she could make him drink her revolution, one cup at a time. The servants' quarters were located in the basement of the mansion, a damp maze of small rooms that smelled like mildew and old stone. There were 6 narrow beds, a single bathroom with cracked tiles, and a toilet that ran constantly, and a small window that looked out onto the trash bins behind the kitchen. This was where the Polish staff lived, sleeping 4 to a room, sharing threadbare blankets, whispering prayers in the dark, and hoping the war would end before they lost their minds. The bathroom was the worst part. The toilet had been broken for months, the handle stuck in a perpetual half-flush that left a shallow pool of water in the bowl. The servants had complained to the German housekeeper, a stern woman from Bavaria who managed the household staff, but she had laughed and told them to be grateful they had indoor plumbing at all. So they learned to live with it, learned to ignore the constant trickle of water, learned to see it as just another indignity in a long list of indignities that defined their existence under occupation. Aniela stood in that bathroom one morning in late February, staring at the toilet bowl, and the idea crystallized into something real. The water was clear. It came from the same pipes that fed the kitchen, the same municipal system that supplied the entire city. Technically, it was no different than the water from the tap, but it was toilet water. It carried the weight of degradation, the psychological taint of waste and filth. And if she could take that water, boil it, turn it into coffee and serve it to a man who thought himself a master race, then she would have achieved something profound. She would have turned his own arrogance into his humiliation. He would never know, of course, that was the beauty of it. He would drink and smile and compliment the brew, never suspecting that a Polish chambermaid had served him a cup of liquid contempt disguised as hospitality. The first time she did it, her hands shook so badly she almost spilled the pitcher. She waited until the other servants were busy in the kitchen, then slipped into the bathroom with a small ceramic jug she had taken from the pantry. The water was cold and still. She dipped the jug slowly, careful not to disturb the surface, careful not to make any sound that might draw attention. Her heart hammered in her chest. This was insane. This was dangerous. If anyone caught her, if anyone reported her, she would be shot or sent to a camp or worse. But as she lifted the jug and carried it back to the kitchen, something shifted inside her. For the first time since the occupation began, she felt like herself again. Not a servant, not a victim, not a ghost moving through someone else's house. She felt like Aniela Nowak, a woman who refused to disappear. She boiled the water in a small pot on the stove, added the coffee grounds that Vogel imported from France, and poured it into his favorite porcelain cup. She carried it upstairs on a silver tray, knocked twice on his study door, and entered when he grunted permission. He didn't look up from his paperwork. He never did. She set the tray on his desk, stepped back, and waited. Vogel reached for the cup without breaking his concentration, brought it to his lips and drank. He made a small sound of satisfaction, the kind of unconscious pleasure people make when they taste something good. Then he waved her away with one hand, already forgetting she existed. Aniela walked out of the room, closed the door behind her, and allowed herself the smallest, most dangerous smile. The war had just changed. He just didn't know it yet. The routine became sacred. Every morning at 6:15, while the other servants prepared breakfast in the main kitchen, Aniela would slip away to the basement bathroom with her ceramic jug. She developed a system, a ritual that transformed an act of desperate defiance into something almost meditative. She would check the hallway first, listening for footsteps, making sure the German housekeeper wasn't making one of her surprise inspections. Then she would enter the bathroom, lock the door, and stand before the toilet like a priestess before an altar. The water had to be taken from the center of the bowl where it was clearest, where it looked most innocent. She would dip the jug slowly, hold it up to the dim light filtering through the basement window, and examine it for any visible contamination. It had to be perfect. It had to be invisible, because the power of what she was doing depended entirely on Vogel never suspecting, never knowing. never having even the faintest idea that his morning coffee was brewed with water from a Polish servant's broken toilet. The psychological weight of the act grew heavier with each passing day. At first, it had felt like a prank, a small act of petty revenge that gave her something to smile about in the darkness. But as the weeks turned into months, as spring arrived and the war ground on with no end in sight, the coffee ritual became something more profound. It became her resistance movement, her underground army, her personal rebellion against everything the occupation represented. Every cup she served was a reminder that no matter how much power Vogel had, no matter how many lives he controlled, no matter how thoroughly the Nazis had conquered Poland, there was one thing he could never take from her: her absolute, unshakable contempt. He could force her to work in his house, to clean his floors, to lay out his uniforms, but he could never make her respect him. And every morning, when he drank that coffee and smiled with satisfaction, she won a small victory that nobody else would ever know about. The other servants noticed changes in her. She walked differently now, carried herself with a kind of quiet confidence that seemed out of place in a house full of terrified people. The cook, an older woman named Helena, who had lost 2 sons in the invasion, pulled her aside one morning and asked if she was all right. Aniela wanted to tell her. She wanted to share the secret, to let someone else in on the joke, to have a co-conspirator who could appreciate the beautiful absurdity of what she was doing. But she couldn't. The risk was too great. If word spread, if the other servants knew, someone might crack under pressure, might confess during an interrogation, might let something slip in a moment of weakness. So Aniela just smiled and told Helena she was fine, that she had simply made peace with her situation, that she had learned to find small joys in the routine. Helena nodded, unconvinced but too exhausted to press further, and returned to her pots and pans. The secret remained Aniela's alone. Vogel, meanwhile, had developed a particular fondness for his morning coffee. He began complimenting it regularly, telling Aniela that she had a gift for brewing, that the coffee tasted different somehow, better than what he'd had anywhere else in Warsaw. He even asked her once what her secret was, and she had looked him directly in the eye and said in flawless German that she simply used the freshest water available and took great care with the temperature. He had nodded approvingly, pleased that at least one of his Polish servants understood the importance of excellence. She had curtsied, lowered her eyes, and retreated from his study before the laughter building in her chest could escape. The irony was almost too perfect. He thought she was trying to please him. He thought her attention to detail was a sign of submission, of a conquered people learning to serve their masters with proper diligence. He had no idea that every sip was an insult, every compliment a testament to his own ignorance. By June of 1940, the toilet water coffee had become such an ingrained part of her daily routine that she barely thought about it anymore. It was automatic, muscle memory, like tying her shoes or braiding her hair. Wake up, fill the jug, boil the water, brew the coffee, serve the general, collect the empty cup, wash it carefully so no one else would use it, and repeat the next morning. 243 days. 243 cups. 243 tiny victories in a war that Poland was losing badly, but something was about to change. Because in a city under occupation, where informants lurked on every corner and the Gestapo rewarded betrayal with extra rations, secrets never stayed secret forever. And Aniela's beautiful invisible rebellion was about to be discovered by the last person she ever expected. His name was Joseph, and he was the mansion's driver, a quiet man in his early 50s who had worked for the Kowalski family before the war and now chauffeured Nazi officers around occupied Warsaw. He had kind eyes that had seen too much, hands that trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching, and a daughter who had been sent to a labor camp in Germany 8 months earlier. Joseph didn't talk much. He kept to himself, did his job, and disappeared into his corner of the basement every night to drink homemade vodka and stare at a photograph of his daughter until sleep finally claimed him. But Joseph noticed things. He noticed patterns. He noticed when people changed their routines, when they started behaving differently, when they carried secrets that made them walk a little taller. And he had been noticing Aniela. It happened on a Tuesday morning in early June. Aniela had finished her usual routine, filled the jug from the toilet, and was walking back toward the stairs when she heard a voice behind her. Joseph was standing in the doorway of the bathroom, still in his sleeping clothes, holding a towel. He looked at her. He looked at the jug in her hands. He looked at the toilet behind her with its cracked bowl and perpetually running water. And in that moment, Aniela's entire world collapsed. Her first instinct was to run, to throw the jug away, to deny everything, to do whatever it took to protect her secret. But Joseph didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just stood there, processing what he was seeing, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding, to something that looked almost like admiration. Then he did something completely unexpected. He smiled. Joseph stepped into the bathroom and closed the door behind him, creating a tiny pocket of privacy in a house where privacy no longer existed. He spoke in a whisper, his Polish soft and deliberate, asking her if she was doing what he thought she was doing. Aniela considered lying, considered playing innocent, but something in Joseph's eyes told her that denial was pointless. So she told him the truth. She told him about the lists she had seen, about the neighbor's daughter, about the crushing weight of powerlessness, and the desperate need to do something, anything, that would make her feel human again. She told him about the coffee, about the 8 months of serving toilet water to a man who signed deportation orders, about the strange satisfaction of knowing that Vogel's pleasure was built on his own ignorance. And when she finished, Joseph was quiet for a long moment, staring at the cracked toilet bowl like it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Then Joseph made a request that changed everything. He asked if he could help, not to stop her, not to report her, but to help her expand what she was doing. He told her that he had access to Vogel's car, that he cleaned it every morning, that he could do things the general would never notice. A loosened bolt here, a contaminated fuel line there, small acts of sabotage that would make Vogel's life incrementally more difficult without ever being traceable. He told her about the other drivers in the German motor pool, Polish men like him who serviced Nazi vehicles and dreamed of revenge. He told her that resistance didn't have to be loud or dramatic, that sometimes the most effective rebellion was the kind the enemy never saw coming. And as Aniela listened to this quiet, broken man describe his vision of 1,000 tiny acts of sabotage spreading through occupied Warsaw like a virus, she realized something profound. She wasn't alone. They formed a pact in that cramped basement bathroom, 2 Polish servants standing beside a broken toilet and whispering about revolution. Joseph would handle the vehicles. Aniela would handle the coffee. Hand together, they would start recruiting. Slowly, carefully, one trusted person at a time, the cook who spit in the soup, the gardener who planted the wrong flowers, the butler who had access to Vogel's private files. They would build a network of invisible resistance, a shadow army of chambermaids and drivers and cooks who refused to disappear. They would make the occupation expensive, 1 cup of coffee, 1 sabotaged vehicle, 1 small indignity at a time, and they would do it all without ever being caught, without ever being seen, without ever giving the Nazis the satisfaction of knowing that the people they had conquered were still fighting back. The toilet water coffee was no longer just Aniela's secret. It was the beginning of something bigger, something dangerous, something that might actually matter. The network grew slowly, like roots spreading beneath frozen ground. Joseph brought in Tomasz, another driver who worked at the German command headquarters and had lost his wife during the bombing of Warsaw. Tomasz brought in his cousin Elżbieta, who cleaned offices at Gestapo headquarters and had access to supply closets full of documents that could be accidentally misfiled or conveniently lost. Elżbieta brought in Father Karol, a priest who still said secret masses in bombed-out basements and moved through the city like a ghost, carrying messages between resistance cells. And Father Karol, who had connections throughout occupied Poland, brought in 24 more. Maids who worked in German hotels, cooks who prepared meals for Wehrmacht officers, janitors who cleaned SS barracks. By August of 1940, there were 37 people involved in what they had started calling the Toilet Water Rebellion, though nobody used that name out loud, and every single one of them was engaged in some form of quiet sabotage that the Germans never suspected. The rules were simple and absolute. Never do anything dramatic, never do anything traceable, never do anything that would make the Germans suspect organized resistance. The goal wasn't to blow up buildings or assassinate officers. The goal was to make the occupation expensive, frustrating and exhausting in ways the Nazis couldn't quantify or combat. Aniela continued her coffee ritual, now joined by 3 other chambermaids in different German households who had adopted the same practice. Joseph and his fellow drivers began a campaign of mechanical sabotage so subtle that German engineers blamed it on poor Polish manufacturing. Fuel lines that mysteriously cracked after a few weeks, brake pads that wore down faster than they should, engines that developed inexplicable knocking sounds that required constant maintenance. The cooks added their own contributions, meals that were always slightly wrong, never bad enough to warrant punishment, but never quite satisfying, always leaving the German officers vaguely disappointed and irritable. The psychological impact was exactly what they had hoped for. German officers throughout Warsaw began complaining about the incompetence of their Polish staff, about how nothing worked properly, about how even the simplest tasks seemed to go wrong in frustrating ways. Vehicles broke down more frequently, paperwork went missing, uniforms came back from the laundry with buttons sewn on crooked, coffee tasted fine, but somehow left officers feeling unsettled without knowing why. The Germans responded by bringing in more supervisors, implementing stricter protocols, punishing servants for minor infractions. But the sabotage continued, invisible and unstoppable, because the people doing it had learned to weaponize their own invisibility. They had learned that being underestimated was a form of power, that being dismissed as stupid or incompetent created opportunities for resistance that the Germans couldn't even imagine. Vogel himself became increasingly irritable as summer turned to fall. His car broke down twice in September, forcing him to requisition a new vehicle. His uniforms never fit quite right anymore, the tailoring always slightly off in ways that made him uncomfortable during long meetings. His coffee still tasted excellent, still earned compliments from visiting officers, but he began having digestive issues that his German doctor couldn't explain. He started sleeping poorly, waking in the middle of the night with a vague sense of unease that he attributed to the stress of managing the occupation. He never suspected that his own household staff was waging war against him. The thought never even crossed his mind. Because in the Nazi worldview, Poles were subhuman, incapable of sophisticated thinking, useful only for manual labor. The idea that his chambermaid might be outsmarting him every single morning was simply incomprehensible. Aniela watched his decline with a satisfaction that bordered on euphoria. Every time Vogel complained about his car, every time he sent a uniform back to be refitted, every time he rubbed his stomach and grimaced during breakfast, she felt a surge of pride that she had to carefully hide behind her blank servant's expression. This was what victory looked like under occupation. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a slow, grinding erosion of the enemy's comfort and confidence. Just 1,000 small cuts that never healed. Just the knowledge that even in the darkest moments of Nazi domination, Polish people were still fighting back in ways the conquerors would never understand. The toilet water coffee had evolved from a personal act of defiance into a symbol of something much larger, the unbreakable spirit of a conquered people who refused to accept their own defeat. The crisis came in October of 1940 when the Gestapo arrested Father Karol. Nobody knew exactly what happened, whether someone had talked under torture or whether the priest had simply been unlucky, caught in the wrong place during one of the random sweeps that terrorized Warsaw every few weeks. But the result was the same. The network's most important connection to the wider resistance was gone, disappeared into the basement cells of WWII prison where screams echoed through stone walls and most people never came out alive. The arrest sent shockwaves through the entire group. If Father Karol broke under interrogation, if he gave up names, if the Gestapo learned about the toilet water rebellion, then every single person involved would be arrested, tortured, and executed. Joseph called an emergency meeting in the mansion's coal cellar at midnight, gathering the core members who worked in Vogel's household, and the fear in that room was thick enough to choke on. They debated for 3 hours in whispered Polish, arguing about whether to disband immediately, whether to flee Warsaw, whether to continue and hope that Father Karol stayed silent. Halina the cook argued for stopping everything, convinced that the Gestapo was already building a case and that continuing would be suicide. Tomasz wanted to go deeper underground, to cut all connections and operate in complete isolation. But Aniela, standing in the corner with her arms crossed and her jaw set, made a different argument. She said that stopping now would mean Father Karol's arrest had accomplished exactly what the Nazis wanted, the destruction of resistance through fear. She said that if they disbanded, if they scattered, if they let terror win, then every cup of toilet water coffee, every sabotaged vehicle, every misfiled document had been for nothing. She said that the priest would want them to continue, that he had known the risks when he joined them, that the best way to honor his sacrifice was to keep fighting in the only way they knew how. The vote was close, but Aniela's argument won. They would continue, but with new precautions. No more meetings, no more shared information about what others were doing. Each person would operate independently, knowing only their own piece of the larger operation. If someone was arrested, they could only betray themselves, not the entire network. It was a harder, lonelier form of resistance, but it was also safer. Josef would continue sabotaging vehicles. Aniela would continue brewing toilet water coffee. The others would continue their own small acts of defiance. And they would trust that somewhere in the darkness of occupied Warsaw, dozens of other people were doing the same thing, chipping away at Nazi control one invisible act at a time. They left the coal cellar one by one, spacing their departures by 5 minutes, disappearing back into their roles as obedient servants, who existed only to serve their German masters. 3 days later, Father Karol was executed by firing squad in the courtyard of WWII prison. The announcement was posted on walls throughout Warsaw, his name listed alongside 11 other Poles shot for crimes against the Reich. The charges were vague: spreading anti-German propaganda, aiding enemies of the state, conspiracy to undermine the occupation. There was no mention of toilet water coffee or sabotaged vehicles, or any of the specific activities he had been involved in, which meant one of two things. Either he had never talked, or the Gestapo didn't believe the confessions they had tortured out of him. Either way, the network was still safe, and Aniela, reading the execution notice on her way to market, felt her grief harden into something cold and unyielding. The priest had died protecting them. The priest had died so they could continue their invisible war, and she would honor that sacrifice the only way she knew how. The next morning, she filled her jug from the toilet bowl with hands that didn't shake anymore. She boiled the water with the precision of a chemist preparing medicine. She brewed Vogel's coffee with the care of an artist creating a masterpiece. And when she served it to him in his study, when he took that first sip and made his usual sound of satisfaction, she looked him directly in the face and smiled. It wasn't the careful, subservient smile of a chambermaid trying to please her employer. It was something else entirely. It was the smile of a woman who knew a secret that would destroy him if he ever learned it. It was the smile of resistance that couldn't be broken because it had already accepted the cost of fighting. Vogel noticed the smile, frowned slightly, and asked if something was amusing. Aniela curtsied and told him in perfect German that she was simply happy to serve him. He nodded, already bored, and returned to his paperwork. She left the room and closed the door. The war continued. Her war continued. And nothing, not even death, was going to stop her now. Winter arrived early in 1941, burying Warsaw under snow and ice that turned the occupied city into a frozen nightmare. Food became even scarcer. The lines for ration cards stretched for blocks. People burned furniture to stay warm. And in the mansion on Aleje Ujazdowski, Vogel hosted a dinner party that would become the crowning achievement of Aniela's invisible war. The general had invited 8 high-ranking SS officers and their wives for an evening of fine dining and classical music, a celebration of the Reich's total domination of Poland. The event required weeks of preparation, special food requisitioned from Germany, French wine stolen from Jewish cellars, silver polished until it gleamed, every detail perfect because Vogel's reputation among his peers depended on demonstrating his sophistication and control. And Aniela, assigned to help prepare the evening's coffee service, saw an opportunity that was almost too perfect to resist. The dinner party coffee would be different from Vogel's usual morning brew. It would be served to 9 people simultaneously, presented in a massive silver samovar that held nearly 2 gallons of liquid, which meant Aniela needed 2 gallons of toilet water. She spent 3 days collecting it, filling her ceramic jug over and over, storing the water in sealed glass bottles hidden in the darkest corner of the basement. She worked during off hours, moving like a shadow, avoiding the other servants who might ask questions about her strange behavior. The risk was enormous. If anyone discovered what she was doing, if the German housekeeper caught her, if one of the bottles broke and revealed the source, she would be executed immediately. But the thought of 9 Nazi officers drinking toilet water together, toasting Hitler with contaminated coffee, complimenting the brew while having absolutely no idea what they were actually consuming, was too delicious to abandon. The night of the party arrived with fresh snow falling over Warsaw. The guests arrived in their black uniforms and expensive furs, tracking slush into the grand foyer, where Aniela and the other servants waited to take their coats. She recognized some of them from photographs she had seen in Vogel's study, architects of the final solution, men responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Jews, bureaucrats who signed papers that turned human beings into numbers and then into ash. They laughed and joked in German, comfortable and confident, completely secure in their belief that they had won, that Poland was theirs, that nothing could touch them. Aniela took their coats with lowered eyes and a blank expression, playing her role perfectly, while inside her mind she counted down the minutes until coffee service. Dinner lasted 3 hours. The servants moved through the dining room like ghosts, serving course after course, while the Germans ate and drank and talked about their plans for the occupied territories. Vogel gave a speech about the new order, about how Germany was civilizing the inferior Slavic peoples, about how future generations would look back on this moment as the beginning of a 1,000-year Reich. His guests applauded. Their wives smiled. And in the kitchen, Aniela and Helena prepared the coffee service, boiling 2 gallons of toilet water in massive pots, adding expensive French coffee grounds, pouring the finished brew into the ornate silver samovar that had once belonged to the Kowalski family. Helena didn't know about the water's source. Nobody did. This was Aniela's secret alone, her personal contribution to a party that was supposed to celebrate Nazi supremacy, but would instead become a monument to their blindness. The coffee was served at 10:30, presented on silver trays with cream and sugar and delicate porcelain cups. Aniela watched from the doorway as Vogel poured for his guests, as they each took a cup, as they raised them in a toast to the Führer and the glorious future of the German Reich. She watched them drink. She watched them smile. She watched one officer's wife compliment the blend, asking Vogel where he sourced such excellent coffee in the middle of a war. She watched the general beam with pride, explaining that quality was simply a matter of high standards and proper Polish servants who understood their place. And in that moment, standing in the shadows of a dining room full of monsters, Aniela Nowak experienced a joy so pure and fierce that it almost brought her to tears. They had no idea. They would never have any idea. And that ignorance, that absolute failure to comprehend that a Polish chambermaid had just served them toilet water and received their compliments for it, was the most perfect revenge she could have ever imagined. The dinner party became legend among the scattered members of the network who still operated in isolation throughout Warsaw. Word spread through careful whispers and coded messages. The chambermaid had served toilet water to 9 high-ranking SS officers and their wives, and they had praised it as the finest coffee in occupied Poland. The story moved from servant to servant, from household to household, carried by people who desperately needed something to believe in, some proof that resistance was still possible even in the darkest moments. For the Poles working in German homes, the tale became a source of strength, a reminder that their oppressors could be fooled, humiliated, and degraded without ever knowing it. Joseph told Aniela that she had become a folk hero, that people she would never meet were drawing courage from what she had done. But Aniela didn't feel heroic. She felt exhausted, hollowed out, and increasingly aware that her luck couldn't last forever. The end came in March of 1942, but not in the way anyone expected. There was no Gestapo raid, no dramatic arrest, no torture or confession. Instead, Vogel was transferred to Berlin, to take a position in the Reich main security office, promoted for his efficient management of the Warsaw occupation. The mansion was reassigned to a different officer, and the entire household staff was dismissed with 2 weeks' notice. For Aniela, the news arrived like a door slamming shut on a chapter she hadn't finished writing. 15 months of toilet water coffee, 457 cups served, countless small victories, and it all ended not with punishment or discovery, but with a bureaucratic transfer and a new assignment. She would never know if Vogel died during the war, never know if he survived to face justice, never know if he ever learned what she had been doing every single morning while he smiled and complimented her brewing technique. Her last morning in the mansion was bitterly cold, with ice coating the windows and frost turning the garden into a sculpture of frozen branches. She went through her ritual one final time, filled the jug from the toilet bowl, boiled the water, brewed the coffee, carried it upstairs to Vogel's study. But this time, when she set the tray on his desk, when he reached for the cup without looking up, when he took that first sip and made his familiar sound of satisfaction, something inside her finally broke. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply stood there watching him drink and felt the crushing weight of everything she had endured compress into a single crystal-clear thought. This wasn't victory. This was survival. And survival, no matter how clever or defiant, was still just another word for living in hell and calling it resistance. Vogel dismissed her with a wave, already focused on his packing, already thinking about Berlin and his new position and the next phase of his glittering career in genocide. Aniela walked out of his study, down the stairs, through the kitchen where Helena was crying over her pots, and into the basement one last time. She stood in the servants' bathroom, staring at the cracked toilet bowl that had been her arsenal for 15 months, and tried to feel something meaningful about what she had accomplished. But all she felt was emptiness. The toilet water coffee had given her dignity when everything else was being stripped away. It had given her power when she was supposed to be powerless. It had given her a secret that sustained her through the worst period of her life. And now it was over, and she had nothing to show for it except the knowledge that a Nazi war criminal had unknowingly drunk from a toilet bowl and lived to tell no one. She left the mansion that afternoon with a small suitcase and 8 zlotys in her pocket, walking out into a Warsaw that was somehow even more devastated than when she had arrived 2 years earlier. The ghetto walls were higher now, the deportations more frequent, the occupation more brutal. Joseph had already disappeared, transferred to a labor camp in Germany. Helena was being sent to work in a munitions factory. The network they had built was scattered to the winds, each person alone again, each small act of resistance fading into memory. Aniela found work in another German household within a week, serving another officer, cleaning another stolen mansion, and yes, she continued her ritual with the toilet water coffee because it was the only thing she knew how to do anymore. But the fire that had sustained her in Vogel's house was gone. What remained was just habit, muscle memory, the mechanical continuation of a war she no longer believed she could win. Aniela Nowak survived the war. That sentence deserves its own weight, its own moment of recognition, because survival itself was an act of defiance in occupied Poland, where 3 million non-Jewish Poles were murdered and entire generations were erased. She lived through the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, hiding in basements while the city burned above her. She lived through the final brutal winter of the war, when starvation killed more people than bullets. And when Soviet tanks finally rolled through the ruins in January of 1945, when the Germans fled and the occupation officially ended, she emerged from the rubble as one of the lucky ones who had somehow made it through hell without losing her mind or her life. But the woman who walked out of the ruins was not the same person who had filled a jug with toilet water on that first morning in February of 1940. War had taken everything from her except her breath, and even that felt like a cruel joke. She never told anyone the full story. After the war, when Poland traded Nazi occupation for Soviet domination, when survivors were trying to rebuild lives from fragments and memories, Aniela kept her secret locked away. She married a factory worker in 1947, had 2 children, who grew up never knowing what their mother had done during the war. She worked as a seamstress, lived in a small apartment in a reconstructed Warsaw that looked nothing like the city she remembered, and slowly, methodically, tried to forget the taste of powerlessness that had defined those years. The toilet water coffee became a story she never shared, not with her husband, not with her children, not with the survivors who gathered on anniversaries to remember the dead. Because how could she explain it? How could she make people understand that serving contaminated coffee to a Nazi general had meant everything to her dignity and absolutely nothing to the course of the war? The story only emerged decades later, in the 1980s, when a young historian researching the daily lives of Polish domestic workers under occupation interviewed Aniela in her apartment. She was 73 years old by then, a grandmother with arthritis and fading eyesight, and at first she refused to talk about the war at all. But something about the historian's questions, something about the way he asked not about heroes and battles, but about how ordinary people survived, broke through her decades of silence. She told him everything. The toilet bowl, the ceramic jug, the 457 cups of coffee, the dinner party with 9 SS officers, the network of servants waging invisible war. And when she finished, when the historian sat there stunned and asked why she had never shared this before, Aniela laughed a bitter laugh and said that nobody wanted to hear about a chambermaid's revenge. They wanted stories about partisans and soldiers, about people who killed Nazis with guns and bombs. They didn't want stories about toilet water, but she was wrong. When the historian published her account in a Polish academic journal in 1987, the story exploded across Europe. It was translated into 17 languages. It became a symbol of civilian resistance, of the thousands of unnamed people who fought back in ways history never recorded. Feminist scholars analyzed it as an example of how women resisted fascism through domestic subversion. Military historians debated whether acts like hers constituted legitimate resistance or mere psychological coping mechanisms. And survivors from across occupied Europe came forward with their own stories of small sabotages, of contaminated meals and damaged equipment and deliberate incompetence, creating a massive archive of invisible resistance that had been hiding in plain sight for 40 years. Aniela's toilet water coffee had opened a door to an entire hidden history of how conquered people fought back when they had no weapons except their own contempt. Aniela Nowak died in 1992 at the age of 81, just months after the fall of the Soviet Union finally gave Poland the independence it had been denied since 1939. She never lived to see the internet, never saw her story shared millions of times across social media, never knew that her name would become synonymous with the idea that resistance doesn't have to be loud to be real. But somewhere in the ruins of history, in the space between the great battles and the famous heroes, her story survives as a reminder that evil can be fought in 1,000 different ways. That dignity can be reclaimed with nothing more than a ceramic jug and a cracked toilet bowl. That even when you have no power, no weapons, and no hope, you can still find ways to refuse defeat. Vogel never knew what he was drinking. He never suspected, never suffered, never paid for his ignorance. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the greatest victories aren't the ones the enemy knows about. Maybe the greatest victories are the ones we win for ourselves, in the quiet moments when we look evil in the face and refuse to let it take everything. Maybe resistance is just another word for remembering that you're human, even when the world treats you like you're not. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.